Good evening. I'll be here a very brief time to introduce our speaker for this evening, I truly could take up all his time with his accomplishments and what he has done. He's a specialist in American legal history, race, and the law, is a graduate of Syracuse University, has degrees in law and humanities from Harvard, PhD and MA from the University of Chicago, so he's gone to where all of you younger students are going to head from MCC to these prestigious academic institutions. He has an astoundingly diverse background and interest. He is not only a constitutional law scholar, but has some side interests in that he was a key witness in the litigation over Barry Bonds' 73rd home run and who owned the baseball. So he's wide-ranging in his interests and his expertise. He was also the chief expert witness in the Alabama Ten Commandments monument case. I have had personal recommendations. People have heard him who say, I heard that and I learned things. So he is now a professor at the Albany University Law School. He's held chairs at Akron Law School, Cleveland Marshall, taught at Hamlin, Chicago, Kent, Brooklyn, and the University of Tulsa. He will talk to us tonight about the Constitution, its role in our legal history, and how it touches on our own Alexander Clark. Paul, thank you.
Thank you very much, Roger, and I especially want to thank President Armstrong for graciously hosting us tonight. This is a delightful venue. I got to sit in his office today, and he was for about 5 minutes beforehand, and he was telling me all of the important politicians who've sat there before me running for office. I'm not running for anything. I don't want you to vote for me, and because the presidential primaries aren't for another 2 years, right? Okay, tonight what I want to do is I want to talk about two things that kind of appear to be separate, but will ultimately be related. I'm here on behalf of the Alexander Clark House, which is a home in Muscatine that was built by Alexander Clark, who from the 1840s until his death in 1891 was the most prominent black in the state of Iowa, and indeed one of the most prominent blacks in the Midwest. Many of you may be sitting there thinking, well, gee, why haven't I heard of Alexander Clark? And the answer is because, as with much of African American history, there's a lot we simply don't know. There's a lot that isn't taught. There's a lot that slips through the cracks. Alexander Clark was a big player. He did many things. He came to Muscatine as a barber and sold cordwood chopping trees and sold wood to steamboats, and he ended up as the American ambassador to Liberia. That's a pretty long way from a barber shop. That's a pretty long way from the woodlot cutting cordwood to sell to steamboats. Along the way, he did many, many other things, which I'll talk about towards the end of this talk. The other thing that I want to talk about, and what I want to start with, is understanding the nature of Iowa and understanding the nature of race and law in Iowa in the 19th century, and to put all of this into some kind of context, some kind of meaning. Because without meaning, all we have is a famous name. Without context, we have Alexander Clark, black guy, built a nice house, big deal. But if we can put what he did in context and give it some meaning, then we begin to say, oh, somebody who did something important, someone who we can learn from. And again, what is most important about this is not the search for heroes. It is not the search for people who did things that we can say, oh, somebody did something. It is rather, what can we today learn from what that person did? How can what Alexander Clark did, how can what happened in Iowa in the 1840s and 1850s and 1860s, how can that teach us about the world we live in today? And that, I think, is what the task is at hand. So let me start much earlier than that, with the very founding of America. And when one looks at the founding of America, one sees that there are two central principles, central issues, central things that dominate the founding of America: liberty and property. The liberty in some ways is obvious. If we think about all of the American history that we've had, we see that America begins as a place where people are seeking liberty. So we will celebrate Thanksgiving in a month and a half, and what we are celebrating, of course, is the Pilgrims, the separatists who came here for the ability to practice their own religion and not be harassed by the King of England, who had an official church and wanted them to practice their religion his way. We think of Roger Williams, who is expelled from the neighboring colony, Massachusetts Bay, because he won't do what the religious authorities in Massachusetts Bay wanted. Because when the Puritans got there, they said, okay, now we're free to practice our faith, and, we don't want to give liberty to anybody else. Roger Williams learned from that, created Rhode Island, which became the first place in the modern world where there was true religious freedom. A spectacular moment in American history and in world history is when Roger Williams goes to Rhode Island. We think of the first Jews who came to what was then the colony of New Netherland, to the city of New Amsterdam in the 1650s, escaping the Portuguese Inquisition in Brazil and ended up in what later became New York. We think of William Penn, who left England to come to a small little real estate deal he got called Pennsylvania. And he got Pennsylvania because the king owed him a lot of money, because his father had lent money to the king's father, and now that the king was back in power, he wanted to pay it off. And rather than pay off William Penn with money, he gave him a piece of real estate, which is today the state of Pennsylvania. William Penn, being a devout Quaker, didn't take Pennsylvania to sell it, but rather he wanted to give it away to other people who would come for religious freedom. So when we think of America, the struggle for liberty is there from the very beginning. America, in part, not completely, but in part, is created by people who are seeking at least liberty for themselves, and some people like William Penn and Roger Williams seeking liberty for everybody. It is not insignificant, by the way, that William Penn begins Pennsylvania in 1681, and in 1689, 8 years later, a group of Mennonites in Germantown, Pennsylvania, and in those days the differences between Mennonites and Quakers are almost impossible to comprehend without sort of a PhD in slight differences among religions, and so they're often called the Germantown Quakers. The Germantown Mennonites issued a statement saying that it was wrong to hold people as slaves, because just because God made people of different colors didn't mean you had the right to hold them as slaves. So again, we see that liberty issue coming at the very beginning. If we switch to the American Revolution, we of course remember the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. They're endowed with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Clearly, liberty is there at the beginning. One of the great questions for the American founding is who should vote? Who should be allowed to participate in politics? Because, of course, in England, voting was restricted only to males who owned a certain amount of property, and even then you might not be able to vote because the voting districts in England had been set in the medieval period, and so you had large cities by the 1770s who had no representation in Parliament, and you also had famously places like the town of Old Sayre, which only had 14 people living in it, but had a single representative in Parliament. It was hard to find anybody from the town to go to Parliament because you kind of had to rotate it because there weren't enough people to go. So for Americans, suffrage, the right to vote, the right to participate in politics, the right to be represented by somebody who actually lived in your district, and to make sure that every district was represented, that too was an aspect of liberty, because you cannot have liberty without democracy. You cannot have liberty without political participation. Those of you in this audience who are American citizens and not convicted felons, if you are not registered to vote right now, as many of your age group is not, then you are in fact undermining your own liberty, because you should be registered to vote, because you should be part of the democratic process, because people have died for your right to vote. And it always astounds me when people don't vote, when people don't participate. And I'm not telling you to vote for, I'm telling you to be involved in the process, because without being involved in the process collapses and you lose your liberty. Tied, by the way, to this notion of liberty was always the concept of immigration, because unless you are a full-blooded Native American, everybody in this room is the descendant of an immigrant. I suppose if you are a foreign student from the Cameroon, perhaps, you are not yet an immigrant, but you may have come here with immigrant intent and didn't tell the immigration people when you got your student visa. And in fact, we are, of course, a native of immigrants. Some people came willingly seeking liberty. Some people came as slaves, the opposite of liberty. And so that is also part of the liberty struggle. If we think about the modern issues of immigration today, one of the things to remember is when Americans struggle to figure out what our immigration policies ought to be, is that there's none of us, except again for the few full-blooded Native Americans, who can say, hey, we shouldn't have immigration, because if somebody else had said that, you wouldn't be here today. I'm always amused, and I don't want to get too openly political about this, but I'm always amused when I listen to that great Irish American Pat Buchanan babble on and on about the problem of immigration, and think, everything you're saying people said about your Irish ancestors when they came here and tried to stop them from coming, because people said if the Irish come, America will fall apart. And then I listen to Pat and I say, well, maybe they were right. But in any event, when we move to the Constitution, again, we see the concept of liberty. Written into the Constitution are fundamental liberties, as well as the fundamental notion of representation, the fundamental notion of the rule of the people, and the people who opposed the Constitution, the anti-federalists, many of them opposed it because we lacked a Bill of Rights to secure even more liberties, and the first Congress passes a Bill of Rights, which is ratified pretty quickly. And so we write into our fundamental documents the liberty of speech, the liberty of press, the liberty of assembly, the liberty of petition, the liberty of religion, the liberty to be not oppressed by religion, as well as the liberty to practice your religion. That is, it is both things. Fair trials, fair laws, the liberty to pursue your own life without interference. The other half of this is property, because, of course, the other thing that Americans come for is the right to be more successful. People come to America because it is the golden door. And whatever direction you came for, whether you came through Golden Gate into California or you came through Ellis Island, which was called by people the Golden Door, it was the same thing. America was the place where people came to pursue property. And so if we go back to Jefferson's language, the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. For Jefferson, the pursuit of happiness was also the pursuit of land, the pursuit of property, the pursuit of acquiring things. And when we think of the new American nation, we see that entrepreneurship is part of the search for property, so that hardly is the revolution over when intrepid New England sailors and merchants the descendants of those Puritans who are now no longer Puritans, who chased Roger Williams out of Rhode Island, and the descendants of the people who went to Rhode Island with Roger Williams, they're both packing up ships and going to China to expand American commerce into China. Again, I'm always amused by people worried about the fact that we're buying things from China. We've been trying to buy and sell things from China since at least the 1780s. Because it's a big market. There's lots of people there in both directions. That's part of the pursuit of property. Now, the pursuit of property isn't always so pretty, because one of the other aspects of this pursuit of property was, of course, the pursuit of land, and that meant a constant westward migration and constant pushing of the Native Americans off of their land to make way for Europeans who were coming to take their lands. And so there was more land to graze on, more farms to farm, more mines to mine, more trees to cut down. The historical ancestors of all of us, and they are all our ancestors, even if you only arrived in America last month or your family came 100 years ago, they're still at least our historical collective ancestors. They looked at the virgin forests of the Midwest and they saw lumber mills waiting to be built. They saw roads waiting to be built. They saw houses waiting to be built. And of course, Alexander Clark looked at the forests along the Mississippi River, and he saw cordwood waiting to be sold to steamboats so he could acquire property, so he could succeed in America. So there is this desire for property that is tied to this desire for liberty. And if we think of some of the fundamental liberty issues, immigration, voting, constitutional protections, they are tied to property just as they are tied to liberty. Remember the slogan of the American Revolution, the slogan that led people to throw tea into Boston Harbor: taxation without representation is tyranny. Of course, those people who threw the tea into the Boston Harbor would be appalled at the concepts of the people who call themselves Tea Party folks today, because the people who threw the tea into the harbor were not opposed to taxation. They understood that you had to have taxation because they understood you had to have government. They simply said it ought to be self-government. They wouldn't understand the notion that you could be opposed to a duly elected government in any kind of violent way, because their principles were that you have a right to revolution when you are not included in the governmental promise, when you're not included in the process of creating government. Jefferson's Declaration is very clear. You have a right to revolt when you are not included in creating the government that governs you. But once you have, as we do in this country, a democratically elected government, then the notion that it is illegitimate is itself an illegitimate notion, because the fundamental notion of America is that you elect the government and the government follows the constitutional rules, and that's how you live with it. But let me continue. We have then these two themes, liberty and property. And it's hard to imagine how you could have one without the other, by the way. It's hard to imagine how you could have fundamental liberty if there was massive poverty. Because if there's massive poverty and no property, then people who do not have will not want to respect the rule of law because they're desperate. At the same time, it's hard to imagine how you can have property without liberty, because then you have tyranny. And as we know, historically always, tyranny leads to revolutions. So it is a combination of the two that creates the American democracy. And now let me turn to the third theme, because the third theme, of course, is the deep contradiction within American culture of liberty and property, and that, of course, is slavery. Because here, with slavery, you have both liberty and property united and in tension. Every slave wants one thing: not to be a slave. Every slave wants one thing: liberty. And what does every slave owner want? To own his property. And so for the system of American slavery, liberty and property are always in tension because you have the fundamental desire of the property to cease being property, and in the language of the 19th century, and I don't mean to use this in a gendered way, I'm using it the way 19th century people would have used it. The property seeks to cease being property and rather to acquire its manhood. And so when you read the speeches of people like Frederick Douglass and Alexander Clark, they talk about manhood, not in terms of man and woman, but rather manhood in terms of human beinghood rather than propertyhood. And this becomes the tension. And then, of course, we get in our Constitution. The Constitution that creates fundamental liberties also protects slavery in a wide variety of ways. The 3/5 clause gives slave owners extra power in the House of Representatives. The Fugitive Slave Clause says that if your property runs away and tries to declare that it is a free person, that it has acquired liberty, you have a right under the Constitution to go and get your property and drag it back to slavery and take this human being and remake him or her into property. And this, of course, is written into the Constitution because the Constitution is written for a slaveholding nation. And while we like to think about America as being a free nation, we need to remember that in 1776, slavery is legal in every one of the 13 states. And in 1787, there are only 2 states that have abolished slavery, and only 3 more that are gradually abolishing slavery. And in the other 8 states, slavery is perfectly legal and people are held as slaves. The Constitution has this dual conflict. Think of the Fifth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment says no person shall be denied life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor can private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Well, what does that mean to slavery? Does it mean that no person can be denied liberty without due process of law, and therefore no one could be held as a slave, because that is the denial of liberty, because after all, no one was convicted and sentenced to be a slave. You were born a slave. Or does it mean, as the Supreme Court interpreted it over and over again in the 19th century, it means that the government can't interfere with your right to own slaves because no one can have their property taken away from them without due process of law. Fundamentally, and more important than any of this, is that the Constitution does not provide for any way for America to get out of slavery. The Constitution creates a government with relatively limited powers, and everyone understands that one of the things the federal government may not do is to regulate the day-to-day lives of people in fundamental ways. Now, I know some of you will say, well, wait a minute, we are regulated all the time by things like minimum wage laws, by labor regulations, by environmental regulations, and if I had a couple of hours or maybe a 3-week seminar, I could explain how all of these evolutions are still consistent with the notion of limited government, because they are. And then some of the things, of course, that the government is allowed to do is to regulate commerce, and so labor regulations or environmental regulations are ultimately a function of regulating commerce between the states. But when it comes to what are called the police powers of the states, the right to regulate kind of day-to-day life at the micro level, that's all the states. If you buy real estate in Iowa, you don't look to a federal law to buy real estate, you look to Iowa law. If you are in an auto accident in Iowa, the fault, the insurance, the payment for suffering is all going to be based on Iowa law, because that is at the local level. If you get married under Iowa law, you don't get married under federal law. If you get divorced, you get divorced under Iowa law. If there's a child custody issue, it's an Iowa child custody issue. It's not a national child custody issue. And in the 19th century, slavery was intrinsically a part of that. So that when he left the Constitutional Convention, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney General Charles Cotesworth, being the hero of the revolution in South Carolina, returned to the South Carolina legislature and said, "We have a security that the general government can never emancipate them, for no such authority is granted, and it is admitted on all hands that the general government has no powers but what are expressly granted by the Constitution, and that all rights not expressed were reserved by the several states." In short, considering all circumstances, we have made the best terms for the security of this species of property it was in our power to make. He's very proud of what they did. Perhaps the greatest accomplishment of the Southerners at the convention is the way we change the Constitution. Because how do we change the Constitution? By amendment. And what do you need for an amendment? You need 2/3 of the Congress to pass the amendment, and 3/4 of the states. Simple math problem. In 1860, there are 15 slave states. If those 15 slave states do not do us the favor of becoming traitorous and treasonous and making war against their own country, but instead remain in the United States, how many free states does it take to pass a constitutional amendment if you have 15 slave states that say no? And the answer is 45. And that leaves us with a 60-state union. So we'd have to have West Iowa and East Iowa and Northwest South Dakota and Northeast South Dakota, and we'd have to divide Wyoming into 4 states, which you could do. You could have antelope in all 4 states and no people in any of it. And you would have to, in other words, create another 10 states to end slavery by constitutional amendment. To put it another way, what the Southerners got at the Constitutional Convention was an ironclad guarantee that as long as they stayed within the constitutional structure, the national government could never end slavery, ever, ever, ever. Now I want to think for a moment about how we get to Iowa from the Philadelphia Convention in 1787. What is the process? In 1776, we are a slaveholding nation where slavery is legal in 13 states. By 1787, as I mentioned, 2 states, Massachusetts and New Hampshire, have ended slavery. 3 states, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Pennsylvania, are in the process of ending slavery, and slavery is legal in all of the west of the states, including what we later consider the North, New York, and New Jersey. By 1787, but that's 1787. By 1798, we have 3 free states because Vermont has joined the Union as a free state. We still have 3 states gradually ending slavery, and we now have 10 slave states because Tennessee and Kentucky have joined as slave states. By 1812, we have 4 free states because Ohio has joined the Union. And we have 5 states that are gradually ending slavery because New York and New Jersey have now joined the rest of the North in gradually ending slavery. And we have 9 slave states. And by 1819, which is our critical date for the next phase of this lecture, we have 6 free states. We have 5 states that are ending slavery, and for all practical purposes, slavery is over in all of those 5 states. So we have 11 free states. And we have 11 states where slavery is perfectly legal. That, then, is the United States in 1819, when Missouri seeks to enter the Union. Now, some of you may remember that in 1787, Congress had passed something called the Northwest Ordinance. And the Northwest Ordinance says that there can be no slavery north of the Ohio River or west of the Ohio River. You should also, of course, remember that in 1787, the land we are standing on right now was owned by Spain, right? It's Spanish America. It had once been French America. They lost the war to England in what we call the French and Indian War, and so they had to give it to Spain. And so the United States ended at that little stream that runs just outside of Muscatine. And everything west of that little stream was foreign country. So when they pass the Northwest Ordinance, they are only passing it for what the United States exists at the time. And of course, we see the Northwest Ordinance as an anti-slavery ordinance because it says there shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude north and west of the Ohio River. But the implication of that is and it comes to pass that there can be slavery south of the Ohio River, Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi. And then Missouri seeks to enter the Union, having been purchased from France because in 1802 Spain gave what was then called Louisiana back to France, and we promptly bought it. So the question is, does Missouri come in as a slave state or a free state? Northerners say Missouri is north and west of the Ohio River. And if you took the southern tip of the Ohio River and you draw a line straight west, most of Missouri is north of that line. Southerners say, are you guys out of your minds? The Ohio River ends at the Mississippi. There's nothing north or west of the Ohio River once you cross the Mississippi, because the Ohio River is irrelevant to what's west of the Mississippi. In a debate which lasts 2 years, Congress reaches a compromise known as the Missouri Compromise. And the compromise says that Missouri will come in as a slave state, and they will allow Maine, which up to that point had been a couple of counties of Massachusetts, to break off and become a free state. Now, people look at this as a balanced compromise. And in some ways it is, in the sense that you get the same number of senators from the North and the South. But of course, think of the potential. Maine has very little. You know, what are Maine's most important products? Snow, ice, moose, maple syrup, lobsters. Not a lot of industry going to be happening in Maine. Missouri is a gigantic state with the potential for enormous growth. And by bringing Missouri in as a slave state, you not only bring in a new slave state, but you bring in a major city, St. Louis, which of course is a slave city. So the potential for growth is there. And it's there in favor of slavery. Following Missouri, of course, we have intermittent admission of other states. And most of your history books, if you read anything about this all, sort of imply that there's a trade-off. Slave state comes in, free state comes in, free state comes in, slave state come in. But that, in fact, is not exactly how it happens. In the 1830s, Michigan comes into the Union as a free state, and Arkansas follows as a slave state. But in the 1840s, both Texas and Florida are brought in as slave states. And so for a few years, there is a two-state majority for the South in the Senate. And it is during these 2 years that the United States goes to war with Mexico, because Mexico refuses to sell us half their country. And so since they won't sell it to us, President Polk, a slave owner from Tennessee, figures there's only one alternative: we'll take it. This is another nuance of the property acquisition. And so we go to war with Mexico, and we end up with California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, most of Colorado, and a good chunk of Wyoming. This then is the Mexican War. And if you remember, the Missouri Compromise said there would be no slavery north and west of the southern boundary of Missouri. That was the other piece of the compromise. You let Missouri in as a slave state, but you no more slavery north and west. But suddenly, we now have new territories west of Missouri: Nevada, Utah, parts of Colorado, parts of Wyoming. And in 1850, the Congress declares that slavery will be allowed in these new territories. So the Missouri Compromise, which was supposed to end the spread of slavery west, is now abandoned for the New Mexican territories. And all of the New Mexican territories are open. New territories that we got from Mexico are open to slavery, except California, which comes in as a free state because it has a rapid growing population because of the gold rush, and most of the people there don't want slavery. But the trajectory would be that you're going to get Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Nevada, Colorado, all as potential slave states. And some people will say, well, you know, what could they do with slavery in those states, because you can't grow cotton there. But of course, historically, slaves have been used for many things besides cotton, particularly mining. And of course, what we know is that those are mining states. Furthermore, we now know Arizona is one of the largest cotton producing states in the country. Once you have irrigation, you can have slavery there, you can grow cotton there. Then in 1854, people want to build a railroad from Chicago to California, and it has to go through Missouri. And in order to get the support of the Missouri Senate delegation, Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois makes a deal. If you'll give me the railroad to the Pacific starting in my hometown of Chicago, I will repeal the rest of the Missouri Compromise for Kansas and Nebraska. But the Kansas-Nebraska Act isn't only about Kansas and Nebraska. Kansas-Nebraska Act allows slavery in present-day Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, Wyoming, parts of Colorado, the rest of Colorado, and a little piece of Idaho. So it opens up, in other words, all of the upper Midwest to slavery. And then in the Dred Scott decision 3 years later, Chief Justice Taney says that under the Constitution, Congress can never ban slavery in the Western Territories. So what is left, which is Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Minnesota, are in theory opened up to slavery as well. So what you see in America up through the 1850s is the increasing power of slavery, the increasing potential for this to become a slaveholders' nation. Abraham Lincoln gives a speech in 1858 in which he says, "You will go to bed one day thinking that the people of Missouri are about to end slavery, and you will wake up to discover that the Supreme Court has declared that Illinois must now allow slavery." And he says in his famous House Divided speech, it must become all one thing or all the other. Either the forces of liberty will push slavery out, or the forces of slavery will push liberty out. And then he makes the important next sentence, which people often don't read. He says, "Have we no tendency to the latter condition?" That is, have we no tendency to the possibility that in fact slavery will push freedom out? And if you lived in the North in the 1850s, you worried. You didn't envision that in just a few years slavery would be over. What you worried about is that in the next generation, freedom would be over. And now I want to turn to Iowa and all this, because where does Iowa fit into all this? We usually think of Iowa as a Midwestern state, or as a northern state, or as a North Midwestern state, a Northwestern state. Iowa's kind of like its little sister to the north of us, whatever its name is, right? Part of the great Northwest. I used to live in St. Paul, and they always made Iowa jokes, so now I can return the favor down here. But people think of Iowa as being the sort of western extension of the great Midwest. Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa. But Iowa begins not as a northern state, not as a northwestern state, but as a border state. Because what does Iowa border when it becomes a state? Missouri, which of course is a slave state, and southern Illinois. And while southern Illinois is part of a free state, southern Illinois is kind of a outgrowth of Mississippi that somehow got stuck in the state of Illinois. Southern Illinois is the Deep South. By the way, when you go home tonight, if you think I'm crazy, you may already think I'm crazy. Go home and take a look at a map of the United States and put a pencil on the capital of the Confederacy in Richmond and draw a straight line across the United States. Which side of that line do you think the capital of Illinois is on? Is it south of Richmond or north of Richmond? And of course, by the way I'm asking the question, you know that Springfield, Illinois is south of Richmond. If you live in Cairo, Illinois, do you live closer to Chicago or do you live closer to Natchez, Mississippi? Think about that. And think about who settled southern Illinois, because it was settled, of course, by Southerners coming out of Kentucky and Tennessee. just as southern Indiana was settled by Southerners, just as southern Ohio was settled by Southerners, just as initially Iowa is settled by Southerners. And what these states have in common, the bottom tier of the Northwest, the bottom tier of the Midwest, is that initially they're deeply racist places. So that the territory of Iowa passes a law that's saying blacks cannot move into Iowa without proving that they are free and without registering with the local authorities and without getting somebody to sign what's called a surety bond. You don't actually have to have any cash exchange, but you have to sign up saying, if this guy goes on welfare, I'll support him. And the Iowa black law of 1839 is virtually identical to the Ohio black law of 1804, and the Indiana black law of 1816, and the Illinois black law of 1818, because all of these states are doing the same thing. They are replicating their laws, and so Iowa begins as very much a southern state. Now, what's curious, however, about the Iowa black law, like the Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois black laws, is they are virtually never enforced. And so it's very hard to find any of these indentures, of these surety bonds. It's very hard to find any listing of blacks registering with local authorities. What we do know is that the Iowa black population grows reasonably rapidly from 1839 onward. In 1851, Iowa has its last gasp at trying to decide whether it's a southern state or a northern state. In 1851, Iowa passes a law which says that no free blacks can come into the state, and if they come into the state, they will be fined $2 a day, and they will be put in jail until such time as either they pay the fine or somebody pays the fine for them and they agree to work for that person to pay the fine off. Now, what I find really weird about this law is that it doesn't say they will be expelled from the state. It doesn't actually make them leave. It just penalizes them for staying here, which leads me to believe that in many ways the Iowa law is kind of like the conflict we have now over immigration. People want to talk about we don't want undocumented aliens, but nobody actually really wants to kick them all out, because what would happen to the economy if you did? That is, I always want, Arizona's just passed this new nuts law, which a federal judge correctly declared mostly unconstitutional. But I would love to see all of the undocumented aliens in Arizona not go to work for 2 days in a row. See what would happen to the state. See if there were any restaurants opening up, if any of the grocery stores would have people restocking the shelves, if any of the gas stations would be operating, if anybody could get their pools serviced or their lawns cleaned or mowed, or lots and lots of other things, not to mention all the people who wouldn't be able to go to work because their child care worker was gone. The fact is that the same thing, of course, occurred in Iowa. Iowa has these laws both fine people who hire undocumented blacks, because that's what they are. They're undocumented free blacks. But, we've unable to find a single case where the local prosecutor prosecuted somebody and got them fined for hiring an undocumented free black. That's the 1851 law. Now, there's one really cute thing about the 1851 law, and it's hard to talk about a law as repressive as this as being cute. But there's one truly charming aspect of the 1851 law, and that is that while the law is being debated, a anti-slavery member of the Iowa legislature manages to slip into the language of the law a statement which says that this law will go into effect when it is published in the Iowa True Democrat. And got to understand something about the politics at the time. The Democrats in the 1850s are the pro-slavery people. They are the ones who are racist. They are pro-slavery. The Free Soilers, who later become the Republicans, are on the other side. So this is an Iowa Free Soiler, meaning, of course, he believes in freedom out here in the West. And he slips into this thing. It must be published in the Iowa True Democrat. And the Democrats in the legislature say, great, that sounds like one of our papers. And this is a patronage deal, because in those days, there's no internet, there's no, you don't get news of the law on Twitter. And so the only way you're going to know that a law is passed is if it's published in the newspaper. So whenever a law is passed, it has to be published in a newspaper, and this is patronage. Legislators vie for who's going to get the patronage. I want it to go to my hometown newspaper. So the Iowa True Democrat in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, will publish this. Unfortunately, the Iowa True Democrat is truly Democrat with a small d, that is, they believe in democracy. It's an anti-slavery paper. So they never published the law. And the question is whether this law is ever enforced. And we can't figure it out, because the following year, the Iowa legislature authorizes a new revised statutes. Every year the laws are passed, and then every 5 or 10 years the legislature will authorize a revised statute, which is all of the laws compiled so that you don't have to go back year by year to find laws. You put everything together. And whenever you do a revised statute, if you want to repeal something without a debate, you just leave it out of the revised statutes and it's no longer on the books. So the funny thing is, in 1851 they passed this law, and then in 1851 they authorized the new revised statutes, which is called the Revised Statutes of 1851, but actually comes out the next year, and the law's not there. So we can't figure out what happened to this law. Was it ever legally on the books at all? Because it's never published in the newspaper and it's not in the revised statute. The Supreme Court of Iowa in the 1860s finally says this law is unconstitutional and was never enforced, and therefore was void from day one. But we don't know. What we do know is that we haven't found anybody prosecuted under this law. We do know that in 1850, just the year before this law was passed, there are about 330 blacks in Iowa. The law is passed saying no black people can move into Iowa, and by 1860 there are over 1,000 blacks in Iowa, which means you either have the most dramatic birth rate in the history of the planet, with every black family having quintuplets every couple of years, or you have, which is the real answer, you have an awful lot of blacks migrating to Iowa and nobody doing anything about it. So this is the beginning of the great change in Iowa. In 1857, there was a proposal on the ballot to give equal suffrage to blacks. Now, you should understand that in 1857, blacks can only vote on the same basis as whites in Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine. Blacks with a certain amount of property can vote in New York, but whites don't need to own property to vote. Blacks in Michigan can vote in school board elections, but nothing else. And in Ohio, blacks can vote in school board elections only if the district has set up a segregated school so the blacks can vote for their own school board. But other than that, black people are not allowed to vote in the United States. So to say that Iowa doesn't allow blacks to vote is to say that Iowa is like virtually every other northern state. But what's fascinating is not that blacks can't vote in Iowa, but that in 1857, the new Republican Party, which is the first anti-slavery party to be effective in America, manages to get on the ballot a black suffrage vote. It loses. Okay? It loses because the majority of Iowans are not quite ready to go all the way and say blacks can be equal to whites because they are bigots, because they are prejudiced, because many of them have never met a black, because there are, after all, under 1,000 of them in the state, and so it would be possible to spend your whole life in Iowa and never see a black person, and what you don't know you may be fearful of. One reason why integration, both racial and cultural and gender and economic and social and international, why all of that is so important, why it is important to have foreign students come to our colleges and American students go abroad for a while, why it's important to have people from other states come to your school and you go to other states, is because the only way you can overcome your prejudices is by being around people that you don't know and understand, and then you say, gee, they are just like me, they have two legs and 2 arms and either 2 or 4 eyes, depending on whether they wear glasses, and they are pretty much the same, and my prejudices are simply stupid. But what's fascinating for 1857 is Iowa votes this. And that's an indication of change. The other indication of change is that in 1857, Iowa writes a new constitution. And in the previous constitutions, the word white had appeared in a number of places, not only in suffrage, but in the school section where it said the state shall provide public education. It said the state shall provide public education for the white children of Iowa. That was the first state constitution. In 1857, they take out the words white and children and they put the word youths in there. So it will provide education for the youths of Iowa. One of the reasons that that clause is written as it is because out of Muscatine comes Alexander Clark, who lobbies the Constitutional Convention and pushes the Constitutional Convention, and he manages to get enough votes in the Constitutional Convention. He's not in it, of course, he couldn't vote for it, he's not a voter, but he manages to use moral persuasion and logical argument to remove this from the school clause. Remember this, because in a minute I'm going to talk about Alexander Clark's greatest contribution, which is to file the first successful school integration case in American history. And he is able to win that case because the Supreme Court looks at the Iowa Constitution and says, you can't discriminate against blacks because the Iowa Constitution says all youths, not just white youths. So this is the process of change. It is during this period that a letter to the Burlington Hawkeye, which is the newspaper in Burlington, a letter to the editor complains, have we no law to prevent the influx of free Negro population into our state? Almost every day this class of population seems to increase among us. And he's right. It is increasing. He's upset about it. The rest of Iowa seems to be saying, so what? By the way, one of the things that the rest of Iowa undoubtedly is saying is that this is a pretty empty state. We still need settlers. We still need labor. We still need people like Alexander Clark to cut wood or to go back to his other profession and cut beards or hair because he's a barber. We still need people because you can't develop an economy without people. Again, to go back to the liberty and property, your property isn't worth much if you can't make use of it. All of the farmland in Iowa is useless if you don't have farm workers to help you work the land. All of the farmland or the potential farmland is useless if you don't have people to help you cut the trees and break that sod. And that's not easy work. So, the result is that Iowa begins to change in a variety of ways in the 1850s. In 1850, 11.9. I'm sorry. I'm looking at the wrong number. Excuse me for one second. In 1850, 13.2% of all the school-age children in Iowa attend school. Many of them attend religious schools, which are private. Some attend public schools. By 1860, 36% of the black children in Iowa are attending public schools. That's nearly a threefold increase. That is a rather dramatic increase in the number of people attending schools. And this is before Alexander Clark files his suit. By the way, the percentage of whites attending the public schools in Florida is only 27.9% in 1860, and in Arkansas it's only 32%. So what you have is a more literate black population in Iowa than you do a white population in Arkansas. By the way, I think nothing's changed. But that is a reality. And again, if you think about the Iowa population, there are 172 blacks in 1840 before statehood, 333 in 1850, and then they passed the law saying they can't come in, and by 1860 there's 1,069. Now, I want to say something else about these population statistics. These are census statistics. One of the things we know about the census is that it consistently undercounts the free black population in the North because, of course, a significant number of blacks in Iowa are fugitive slaves, and as fugitive slaves, they don't exactly run up to the census taker and say, "Oh, count me, count me." So, in fact, probably the Iowa black population is much larger than the 1,099 or 1,066, I'm sorry, that the census takers find. Okay. Now I want to shift a little bit to the courts of Iowa, because the courts of Iowa are fascinating in the way they deal with racial issues. In 1839, when Iowa was still a territory, a black man in Missouri cuts a deal with his master. And the deal is this: I will go up to Iowa where there's mining down in southern Iowa, and I will go up to mine and I will make money and I'll send you back money and I will buy my freedom. And the master says, fine, you do that. And so Ralph, who's the name of the slave, goes up to Iowa, and he mines, and it turns out mining isn't as profitable as he wishes it was, and Ralph doesn't make very much money, and he seems to forget to send any of it back to his master in Missouri. And so his master goes up to Dubuque County, which is where Ralph is now living, and he grabs Ralph and tries to bring him back to Missouri as a slave. The white people living around Ralph come to his rescue. White Iowans, and by the way, Ralph hasn't signed any of these registrations registering with the county. Ralph hasn't produced papers that he's free, in part because he can't, because he wasn't when he got here. Nevertheless, the local sheriff intervenes on behalf of Ralph, not on behalf of the master, not on behalf of the Iowa registration laws. And the case comes before the Iowa Supreme Court. It's the first case that the Iowa Territorial Court reports. Volume 1, page 1 of Morris's reports, which are the Territorial Supreme Courts, is In re Ralph. And what the court says is fascinating. The court says that Ralph is not a fugitive slave because Ralph didn't run away from Missouri. His master let him come from Missouri. Fugitive slaves are runaways. Ralph didn't run away from anybody. And basically, if you're dumb enough to let your slave come to Iowa, you're dumb enough to lose your slave. And so Ralph becomes free. Now, this law will eventually become the law in all of the North. By 1860, every northern state will hold that if you bring your slave voluntarily to a northern state, the slave becomes free. The only distinction is that some of them cut you a little slack. So that in Illinois, if you are simply cutting across Little Egypt from Kentucky to Missouri, and you go by land, and you don't stop, and you don't rent out your slave, and you don't farm, you just cut through, you kind of have a free pass, you can cross southern Illinois. New Jersey allows you to visit for a little while. But the rest of the North, by 1860, has a pretty flat ironclad rule. If you come into our state, you are free. The most important case along this line begins in New York in 1852, when a family of Virginians, the Lemon family, is moving from Rockingham County, which is in the Shenandoah Valley, just north of Roanoke, Virginia. They're moving from Rockingham County to Texas. And the best way to go from Rockingham County, Virginia to Texas is to take a steamboat from Norfolk to New York City and then change boats and go all the way direct steamboat to New Orleans. They get to New York City, they rent a room in a hotel, they lock their 8 slaves in the hotel and they go out to dinner, and they come back to find the sheriff with a writ of habeas corpus, wondering why they have locked up these 8 colored citizens of Virginia. And the New York courts rule, after 3 different courts ruled the same thing finally in 1860, that you brought your slaves to New York, they became free the moment you sailed into New York Harbor. You may not bring slaves into New York. I want to do an aside here for a moment because I'm a historian and a scholar, and usually all of my work is in archives and in dirty old pieces of paper in newspapers or in law books. And I had written at one time in my life, I was the only person in the country at the time to write about the Lemon slave case, which involved a man named Jonathan Lemon. And the Lemons lost their slaves in New York. And it's a very important case for much of my scholarship. And about 5 years ago, I got a letter from somebody, and the letter says, "Dear Professor Finkelman, my name is Jonathan Lemon." And it turned out to be the great-great-grandson of this guy. He had read about the case in my book. He had tracked me down. I went and had dinner with him. And I was just blown away. And so I asked him, what happened to your relative? Because what happens to Jonathan Lemon is this: his slaves are free. And then the New York business community, here we again, the tension of property and liberty. The New York business community, not wanting to insult Virginia, takes up a collection and gives Jonathan Lemon $5,000. And in fact, the judge who orders the slaves freed throws in $50 because he says, I don't want to take your property away from you because I understand this is your entire wealth, but at the same time, we believe in liberty enough to be willing to pay for it. So the Lemons get $5,000, which is a huge amount of money in those days. And so I said, what happened? And he said, well, it's really interesting. Jonathan and his wife, Juliet Lemon, went back to Rockingham County. They bought a lot of land, and they bought no slaves, and we still own that land in Rockingham County because they figured out that slavery wasn't a smart thing to do. So that's sometimes good things being forced on you sometimes work. Anyways, to go back to Iowa, and the important point is this. The decision that New York reaches in 1852, the decision that the Pennsylvania courts reach in the 1840s, is the decision that the Iowa court reaches in 1839, which puts it ahead of every other state except Massachusetts and Connecticut, which had already reached this decision. So what we see is that as early as 1839, there is a stunning progressive nature coming out of Iowa. Then, as we've seen in 1857, the new Constitution says that you will not discriminate in schools on the basis of race. Now, does that mean that all the Iowa schools are immediately integrated? Absolutely not. Does it mean that some of the Iowa schools are immediately integrated? Absolutely yes. And does it mean that some of the schools don't need to be immediately integrated because they were already integrated? Yes. And if you could sort of if we could all get into the, if you all remember my favorite TV character of all times, Mr. Peabody, and Mr. Peabody was a dog, of course, who had a pet boy, and Mr. Peabody had a Wayback Machine. And if we could all get into Mr. Peabody's Wayback Machine and go back to Iowa in 1856, what we would find is that in some places in Iowa, there are already integrated schools. In some places in Iowa, there are completely segregated schools. And in some places in Iowa, the people aren't quite sure what they're doing from day to day because they are in the process of changing. And that's the most important thing to understand. History is not a snapshot. History is a moving target. It is a motion picture, so to speak. It's a movie. It's always changing. And so what we see in the 1850s is a changing Iowa. And then we get the Civil War. Civil War, of course, changes everything about America. At the very beginning of the Civil War, Alexander Clark of Muscatine writes to the governor and says, I'm ready to organize a regiment of blacks from Iowa. I can't imagine how big the regiment would be because there are only 1,000 blacks in the state. How many of them are males of military age? I don't know. But he's ready to start organizing them. Eventually, in fact, there will be a regiment of blacks coming out of Iowa because during the war, lots of blacks suddenly decide to follow Ralph from Missouri without the permission of their masters, and they flood into Iowa, and you get a black regiment out of Iowa. But Clark goes to the governor and writes to the governor and says, I'd like to do this. And the governor writes back. It's a perfectly wise, smart political letter. He says, you know perfectly well that your neighbors won't allow this. It isn't happening. You know perfectly well that the majority sentiment in Iowa is not yet ready to allow black soldiers. It's a very warm letter. It is not antagonistic. It is not racist. He simply says it can't happen yet. By the way, it also legally couldn't happen because the 1792 militia statute passed by the federal government, and the federal government, of course, controls the militias. The 1792 militia statute says that only white people can serve in the militias. So, in fact, he couldn't have organized an Iowa unit because it would have been a militia unit. However, by the fall of 1862, all this has changed because, of course, Lincoln has moved to issue the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, and the next day after issuing the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln authorizes the enlistment of black troops. Congress repeals the Militia Act discrimination, and Clark helps organize what I think becomes eventually, and I may have the unit number wrong, but I think it's the 40th U.S. colored, 60th, I was off by 20, not too bad for a New Yorker. The 60th U.S. Colored Troops starts out as the first Iowa Colored Regiment. Yes, the first Iowa Regiment of African descent. Okay, becomes eventually the 60th U.S. Colored Troops Regiment. So that is organized, and one of the key organizers is, of course, now Sergeant Major Alexander Clark. Now, Clark actually has a bad leg. He can't possibly serve in the Army. And one of the things that we do not know, but we need to find out, because, as I said, history is hard. It's very hard to piece these things together, is whether he is actually a sergeant major or whether he's simply called a sergeant major. And that, you know, it's kind of like, I'm almost embarrassed to admit it, but I'm legally a Kentucky colonel because I once gave a talk in the state of Kentucky, and they made me a Kentucky colonel. I got a certificate signed by the governor. The only thing it gives me the right to do is to get Kentucky Derby seats slightly cheaper than anybody else. Is there an equivalent in Iowa? Do you get to be like an Iowa Hawkeye or an Iowa Hawk or something? I don't know. There are a number of states that have these kind of honorific things. So the question is he a sergeant major the way I'm a Kentucky colonel, or is he a sergeant major the way people with real stripes on their arms are sergeant majors? We don't know. I hope in the next year or two we'll sort that out. But the important thing is that he helps organize the troops. And it is during the Civil War, of course, that everything changes in Iowa. The Supreme Court declares the 1851 law unconstitutional, and the barriers begin to come down. And in 1868, Alexander Clark sues to get his daughter, Susan Clark, into the local public school rather than into a private school. And the question before the Iowa Supreme Court is, what is the law here? Significantly, by the way, the local court in Muscatine declares that she has to be allowed into the public school. So the case is brought to the Supreme Court on appeal by the school district. Now, one of the things I don't know, and maybe we will never know, is why the school district appealed. That is, if the local court says you should integrate, is the school district out of step with the local court, or is the court out of step with the public sentiment? We don't know. But we do know that the local court says integrate. The school district appeals to the Iowa Supreme Court. And the Iowa Supreme Court writes a dramatic and very important decision. It basically says that under the previous Constitution, the 1846 Iowa Constitution that made Iowa state, the Constitution says the school shall be open and free to all white persons. And the 1857 Constitution says that the State Board of Education shall provide for the education of all the youths of the state through a system of common schools. And the court says that is it. If it's all the youths of the state, then it's all the youths of the state, and that you cannot make a distinction between children on the basis of color. A local newspaper has an editorial in which it says, "They are not animals that are thus treated. They are children," in capital letters, "human beings. What crime have they committed? Simply the crime of having been created by God Almighty with a colored skin. That is all." And this local newspaper therefore says, of course you should integrate, because how can you punish people simply because God Almighty made some of us white and some of us black? And that is a dramatic decision. This is the first decision in the history of the United States in which a court says that you must integrate your public schools. There had been one other school desegregation case in Massachusetts which had lost, because the Massachusetts Supreme Court said that there is nothing in the Massachusetts Constitution that prohibits the city of Boston from segregating the students. 3 years later, the Massachusetts legislature changed the law explicitly prohibiting segregation. So Iowa's not the first place to have integration, because Massachusetts beats them and a couple of other states beat Iowa in that regard. But it's the first time that a state says it is a function of constitutional right as opposed to legislative prerogative. Because if the Massachusetts legislature could segregate or integrate, then the Massachusetts legislature could turn around and segregate. But what the Iowa court is saying is that no, you cannot segregate. We conclude that the law makes no distinction whatever as to the right of children between the ages of 5 and 21 years to attend the common schools, and that there is no discretion left with or given to the board of directors to make any distinction in regard to children within the specified ages. Now, under our Constitution, which declares that the provision shall be made for the education of all the youths of the state, which the court italicizes, through a system of common schools, which constitutional declaration has been affected by enactments, you cannot discriminate on the basis of race. This is a dramatic case, and it's an important case. The case will be used by lawyers over and over again. It will be cited sometimes in support of integration, sometimes in opposition to integration. There will be courts that will say, well, we don't follow the nutcases up in Iowa. I know people in Iowa never think of themselves as radicals, but, I mean, this is the least radical place on the planet, except that on racial issues, it is what the historian Robert Dykstra called a bright radical star. It is indeed extraordinarily radical on race, quoting President Grant. And the important issue is that Iowa does this, and the player in this is living right downtown in Muscatine, pushing for this. 5 years later, in a case called Koger versus the Northwest Union Packet Company, the Supreme Court declares that the steamships in Iowa cannot discriminate on the basis of race when it comes to serving meals on board the boat. Koger was a black woman who bought a ticket which included a meal. They refused to let her sit down and have her meal. She objected. They had to physically throw her out. She must have been one tough person. And she then sued and won damages. 2 years after that, there is the case of Smith versus Des Moines schools, followed by Dove versus the independent schools of Keokuk. One after another, the court faces school desegregation cases in those cities. And in the Keokuk case, the court simply says, we decided this in Clark, and we decided this in Smith versus Des Moines. We don't have anything more to say on the subject. And that's the end of segregation, at least legally in Iowa. Now, does that mean that segregation ends in Iowa? Probably not. Does that mean that there's no racism in Iowa? Probably not. What it does mean is that the formal rights are enshrined. Getting the formal rights doesn't always give people the actual rights, but without the formal rights, it's a lot harder to get the actual rights. And what Clark does as a civil rights activist is to fight for the formal rights, because he understands that only with the acquisition of the formal rights can you actually get real equality. He himself goes on to do other things. He becomes a leader of the Prince Hall Masons in both Iowa and Missouri. He starts a newspaper in Chicago, for a while the only black paper in the city of Chicago. His partner in this, by the way, is the husband of a very famous black activist, Ida Wells Barnett, who is the leader of the anti-lynching crusade. Her husband is Alexander Clark's partner in a black newspaper in Chicago. When he sells his portion of the newspaper, he remains in the newspaper business and works with the Guild of Black Newspapermen for a number of years. He is a partisan in the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, the party of anti-slavery, throughout the rest of the 19th century, involved in politics. In 1876, he goes to the National Fair in Philadelphia to celebrate the centennial of American independence, representing his race at the fair. Now, on one hand, we look at this and we say, oh my God, you have one guy to represent a race. I mean, what kind of idiocy is this? On the other hand, of course, it's the signal of a dramatic change, because if there had been a fair in 1857, there wouldn't have been any representatives of his race except the slaves helping clean up the fairgrounds after it was over. And Clark is part of the delegation that represents blacks. Throughout the period from the 1840s through the Civil War, he is involved in what are called colored conventions. These are conventions of African American activists around the country, some here, some in the East. He goes to Syracuse for one big convention, where he works with other abolitionists, other black leaders like Frederick Douglass. In 1889, Frederick Douglass, the most important black in the nation, is appointed ambassador to Haiti. Before that, Frederick Douglass had been the recorder of the deeds in Washington, D.C., which was a really big patronage job, because the recorder of the deeds allowed you to run a big office and hire lots of people. That was Douglass's patronage. He gives his patronage job up to go to Haiti, and Clark writes, "My dear friend Douglass, we've been friends for a long time. Congratulations on going to Haiti. And by the way, would you recommend me to be recorder of deeds for the city of Washington?" I don't know whether Douglass recommends it or not, but a few months later, he is appointed ambassador to Liberia, which is the only other diplomatic position that blacks are allowed to hold in the United States at this time, because there are only two black countries, Haiti and Liberia. Those are the only place we can send a black diplomat, because racism in America and racism overseas would prevent sending a black diplomat somewhere else. He goes to Liberia, and unfortunately he dies in Liberia, like a number of other American ambassadors, because it's a horrible climate. It's got malaria, it's got yellow fever, it's got other tropical diseases, and of course he's not prepared for the climate, he's not prepared for the weather, and by this time he's an elderly man, and so he dies, and eventually he is brought back here and buried. What do we make of all this? What does all this mean? Part of it means that Muscatine properly is trying to honor one of its greatest citizens, a man who went from cutting wood for steamships to helping make American foreign policy as ambassador to a foreign country. That in itself has great value. But we can also learn from the story of Alexander Clark the values of hard work, the values of never losing sight of liberty, and also the value of getting some property along the way, because he's able to do this because he can afford to do it, because he understands the connection between work and education. Late in life, he goes to law school. His son is the first black graduate of Iowa Law School. He goes to law school after his son goes to law school to continue his education, to continue his learning. He fights for education for his daughter because he understands in 1868 that the key to success and the key to equality and the key to liberty and the key to democracy is ultimately having an educated population. Without that, you don't get any of these things. So he fights for that. And finally, what we can most learn from him, of course, is the incredible value of determination and of sticking to the cause and of fighting for what you think you deserve. Because if you feel discouraged about making the world a better place, if you feel discouraged about the fact that, gee, I worked for a change and it didn't happen, I worked for a better law and it didn't happen, I think I'll just go back to my way of life and become apolitical. I won't participate in civic values. I've tried to clean up the pollution, it's still there. I guess I just better go and smoke another cigarette or pour some more gasoline into the Gulf of Mexico. You only need to look at somebody like Alexander Clark, who came here in the 1840s when it was kind of illegal for him to be here, who helps fugitive slaves, who lives in a nation where the slaveholders control the presidency, where the slaveholders control Congress, where the slaveholders control the Supreme Court, where slavery is spreading, where slavery is powerful. And you fight against that for year after year after year after year. And then when you finally win, you discover, but you didn't get full equality, and so you have to turn around and fight for that. And there's a certain amount of persistence and determination in this man's life that is a lesson to everyone here. And I'll leave you with that thought. I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.